My name is Nancy Dillette, and I'm an academic associate at Arizona State University and an oral historian. Today is December 4th, 2003, and I'm joined by Dr. Noel Stowe, who's chair of the history department at Arizona State University and the director of the public history program. And together, we're beginning the Arizona City-County Management Oral History Project. We're interviewing Mark Keane, who has served the ICMA, the International City Council Management Association, for 35 years and is now an ICMA Executive Director Emeritus. We're fortunate to be in the studios of Channel 11, the City of Phoenix cable station, who have generously offered us the studios and are recording the interviews for us. And we're grateful for this opportunity to have this unusually high-tech equipment to conduct an oral history project. This doesn't usually happen. We hope this will be the first of as many as needed to capture and document the history of life members, to share their values and principles of the people who created the strong council management form of government, and to help new generations to clarify the role of the manager. Arizona has produced a disproportionate number of legendary professional managers, and this is an attempt to document the contributions of life members of the Arizona City and County Management Association. So let's get started with an early piece of your story, and tell us where and when you were born.
I was born in Chicago in 1919, so that makes me about 84.
And what was the first contact you had with even the concept of city manager form of government?
Well, I can back down from that just a tiny bit and answer in terms of the first contact I had with local government.
Okay.
It happens that my mother was part of the Irish clan of Chicago, and among her friends was a man named Joseph Gill, and he was the clerk of the municipal court of the city of Chicago, which doesn't sound like much, but he later became the chairman of the Democratic Committee of Chicago, which we all know was responsible for more than one election outcome. A very powerful political organization, maybe the most powerful and effective one that there ever was in America. So, lo and behold, she got me a summer job in the Chicago City Hall in the office of the clerk of the municipal court. And that was my first experience with local government. Everybody in the office was a precinct captain. Everybody there had a strong political reason to be on the payroll. There were Polish, Irish, Germans, Jews, blacks, everything representing the various ethnic groups of the city of Chicago. And it was just a great pleasure to get to know them. And at the same time, I realized that at least 2/3 of the cost of running that place was a waste of money. But anyhow, that was a great education for me. And it did make me start thinking that, my God, there must be a better way to run a local government than this. And one of the things that bothered me was that it was all special privilege, that if you were a political supporter, then they would pay attention. Otherwise, not.
What was your role at that first summer job? What were you hired to do there?
Well, I'll give you an example. In the mornings, I was on the counter. In the morning, in would come the men. And remember, this is a municipal court. And these were the subjects of hearings and judicial actions on wife support or woman support and child support. So the man would come in the morning and he'd be bitching and swearing and complaining about the woman, and he'd plunk down his $5 or $10 or whatever it was, and I would write him a receipt and listen to him, of course, sympathize with him, and then in the afternoon the woman would come in to get her $5 or $10, and so I would write a check to her while she lambasted the man. And so that was about the greatest thing I learned in the whole process. It was a very interesting experience. I did it for 3 summers.
Did you do the same thing for each of the 3 summers? Did you come back, or did that change
that
over
plus
time?
a lot of routine paper sorting and so on. There were no mechanization. Of course, that was typically the case at that time anyhow. But it was, and most of the time probably I walked around and talked with the precinct captains in the office. And that's where I learned the most.
Can you give us an example of one of the things that you saw that really led you to believe how much money was being wasted at the local government level?
Oh, well, that they were totally consumed with routine work, in many cases unnecessary, and that they simply weren't producing anything for half the time. But I found the culture, the environment very enjoyable. That I didn't have to work very hard either.
So you said that this was an opportunity for you to see that it could be done in a better way, a more efficient way. And when was the first time that you had first contact with other people who were looking at really changing that form of government?
Well, a friend of mine in high school named Wally Dunn, he was the president and I was the vice president of the senior class, introduced me to his brother Roger Dunn, who had gotten, well, he was leading a campaign to get the city of Chicago to adopt a council manager form of government, which of course was on the face of it absolutely ridiculous that anybody would have such a dream. But I had Wally set it up, and I went over and met Roger and talked to him about it. And so I very much admired the man that would conceive of doing something, even though he knew it himself that it was practically impossible. Mm-hmm. So I had that brief contact, and then until I went to college, the thought didn't go through my mind again. Mm-hmm. But then when I went to college, I got a scholarship to Purdue, where the tuition at that time was $50 a semester. So the scholarship covered the whole tuition.
And what did that enable you to study at Purdue?
So I signed up in civil engineering, because I'd always liked math, physics, chemistry, and philosophy, as that matter. And then I discovered in my freshman year they had a program called Public Service Engineering, which I went to see the dean of that, Dean Potter, and he explained it to me. That, just a little bit. Thank you. That
Thanks, Ken.
That this was designed to train engineers, yes, civil engineers, but those who would go into the public service as city engineer, highway engineers, and possibly city managers. They hadn't heard of city managers. And so I switched into that in my sophomore year. And so I had at least 2 years of a full civil engineering program, and then included much more business management and public administration and public finance and so on in my last 2 years. So it was a perfect program for me, and I became more and more interested in the council manager form at that time.
Is your degree in engineering? Is it in public service engineering?
It's in public service. It's a Bachelor of Science in Public Service Engineering. The program had only existed for a few years before I got to Purdue. This is in 1937 to 41. And strangely enough, they eliminated the program a couple of years after I graduated. I don't know what the significance of that is.
Were there other programs throughout the country at that time, or
No, it's
Purdue?
the only one I ever heard of before or since.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, we'll have to look into that. So you got your early training then, and what was the world of council manager at that time? What were you learning about the possibilities of installing that in various places?
Very little. I had one textbook in municipal government by a man named Monroe that discussed the council manager plan favorably. But I had no contact with a real-life city manager or with the City Managers Association. And of course, in those years, uppermost in our mind is whether we were going to go into the military service or not. And at ROTC, at Purdue, I took 4 years of ROTC. And so I knew that after Pearl Harbor, there was no doubt about it. And so I didn't think at all about city management or government in that particular period. Thought about finding a wife and having our first child and things like that.
And what did you do during the war years?
Well, they first sent me off to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to the Field Artillery Replacement Training Center. And I was a field artillery officer, but didn't know anything much about it, really. And so then after that, they sent me to Fort Sill to become a communications officer, learn how to lay wire and or get wire laid, and how to operate the elementary kind of radio communication systems that were available to the military at that time. And then they sent me off to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, to organize a division that had been inactive since World War I. Not to organize, but to help organize. And so we took these raw recruits from all over the country, and we were no better informed than most of the recruits ourselves. And we put together a very good infantry division, the 85th Infantry Division. And we were on maneuvers in Louisiana, in the swamps of Louisiana, in the desert of Southern California, and finally sent overseas in December of 1943. And we landed in Casablanca, took the 40 and 8 train. 40 and 8 is a train where the boxcars are big enough to hold 40 soldiers, 40 people, or 8 chevaux, 8 horses. And so they took us across northern Africa, the Atlas Mountains, into Algeria, and stuck us in a former prisoner of war camp. And we did some more training, and were sent in March over to Naples by ship, of course, and put into the line. And we were in combat position against the Germans in Italy from the first kickoff in just the start of spring 1944 until the Germans surrendered in Italy. They surrendered in Italy before they did in the European main continent, as you know, in around August of 45. So that was another great experience. Being in the field artillery, I wasn't in the front lines, but I developed a tremendous respect for those who were, which is actually a very small percentage of the total number of men and women that were in the armed forces during World War II. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's probably not 10%, that were actually in the front lines in direct contact with the Germans or Japanese. So, but I learned a lot.
What kind of things did you learn that were shaping influences on being a manager later?
Well, I was a captain in the artillery and in charge of the Fire Direction Center, along with along with a great guy from Wisconsin. We called him the Gremlin. His name was John Verrill. I still keep in touch with him. And we had a battalion commander named Davis. I keep in touch with him. He's, and then a couple of other guys, the supply officer, keep in touch with him. And we're all getting ginned up to go to the dedication of the World War II Memorial, which is going to be on May 29th of next year. So those of us that can walk or crawl are going to be there. It took so long to get that memorial approved and done that there aren't very many left. Back to your question. It was the first time I had worked in a supervisory position, if you can call the Army a supervisor. And with the Army's necessary form of command, control, I learned a lot. And of course, even though the strict discipline is essential to the operation of a military unit, I also learned how important it is in the interpersonal relations. That I had to know and understand and work intimately with the enlisted men in my outfit. The ones in my part of the organization were the smartest ones we could find that could handle computing, simple computing, of fire commands that were sent from our Fire Direction Center to where the guns were, the batteries we called them. So just working in an organization of that nature with such a life and death decisions. One time am I going on too long about this?
Please go on.
Sergeant Valentine was our survey officer. Doesn't sound like much, but we had excellent Italian maps in good large scale, and we could usually spot ourselves exactly where we were on the map for our guns and where the target was. We had forward observers out who would send back the info, usually by radio when we were on the move, by wire if we weren't. And then our guys would have to compute how to get from the muzzle of the gun to the enemy. And so these were bright guys, and they usually had ranks from sergeant on up. So working with them and all the other guys was just a great experience. And when my wife and I went to Italy a few years ago and found the wonderful memorial that had been erected to our regimental combat team. I don't know when I've talked this much about it. There's something about you, I guess, that gets me started. So I just choked up when I got there, and it's undoubtedly because of all those feelings that I developed towards those guys that survived together. Nothing quite like it. So now that, again, back to your question, I think does have a lot to do with your preparation for being a manager. In fact, a lot of us as city managers sometimes think we are in some form of warfare. Where in many cases you don't have the power to fire back. You are the target, but not shooting back.
How did you get that experience to translate to your first city management position, which I think was maybe assistant city manager in Wichita?
Well, all of that translation, of course, is intuitive and beyond consciousness. I'm sure I felt more comfortable with people in an organization because of that military experience. Of course, there's some similarity to sports also. I thought I was a pretty good baseball player, but I don't think I really was. But I had the team experience. So all those kinds of things help. And as to the first city manager position, when I got out of the service in '45, my wife and I say my wife and I because it was a joint decision, accepted an offer to go to a consulting firm that consulted only for governments. They were a government management consulting firm located in Chicago. And obviously I still had this burning desire to get into government rather than the corporate world, and with an engineering degree I could have gone into the corporate world easily. And during that consulting work I got a lot of good experience with governmental organizations, because one of the things that we did in our consulting was to set up pay systems for local governments, state governments, and for parts of the feds. And in doing that, I had to go around and interview all kinds of employees from all levels in cities and states, and then decide what to recommend in terms of a classification of the job and the pay level for the classification. And sitting and talking with those employees and listening to them about their jobs and how they related up and related down and what was good and bad about the organization was another great experience. Okay, so back to your question then with Wichita. My wife and I, by that time, had 3 children after 3 years of consulting and moving around. And so I accepted an offer from the city of Wichita to be the assistant to the city manager. City manager was a great guy. He had a couple of, I wouldn't call them weaknesses, but diversions. One was he drank quite a bit, and the other one was that he loved the girls and any occasion. So I learned a lot from that too. But he was a great manager, politician. He had a feeling for politics because he had been an elected city commissioner in Topeka, Kansas, before he was appointed the city manager, the professional position in Wichita. So just watching him operate with the city council of Wichita was a great experience.
Was he a good mentor?
Yes, when asked. He and I worked very closely together, but he was not one to be offering advice unless I asked it. And a lot of the best mentors, I think, are that way. They don't have to sit down and say, well, what's bothering you today, or what can I do make you a better manager. So yes, he was a good mentor.
What had happened generally in the profession? Because you had mentioned Roger Dunn had this audacious plan for Chicago. So what had happened in those intervening years that places like Wichita were going with council-manager form of government?
Yes, well, there'd been a lot of pre-war changes and adoption of the council-manager form of government, and some abandonments where it just didn't work out, like Cleveland, Ohio, and Knoxville, Tennessee. But it had not been a big growth. But after the war in 1945, as with so many aspects of our life and our economy, there was great change. And so there was great change in the form of local government, in the activities of local government. Instead of just keeping the ship afloat, they began taking on more responsibilities, and so there was a big increase in the number of cities that adopted the council-manager form of government then, starting in 1945.
Can you fill us in a little bit about the development of ICMA so that we get some of that early history of where it came from and its relationship to the National Civic League?
Okay.
And then we'll come back to where we were.
Yeah, well, where we were in Wichita, I didn't know much at all about the association. But then, of course, later on, I learned everything there was to know about it. It started in 1914. And interestingly enough, it started in Wichita, in Kansas, at the University of Kansas. And the first executive director of ICMA was in Kansas at Lawrence. His name was John Stutz. And he was already the executive director of what was then the American Municipal Association, which is an association of all the cities in the country. And he was also the executive director of the Kansas Municipal League, which, as you can imagine, was the association of cities in Kansas. So when there were enough managers, about a dozen or 15 who could get together for a conference, decided they should form an association, they asked this guy to be the executive director. So he said, I've already got these two jobs. As I said, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't take you much time to do these other jobs. You can do ours too. So he agreed. John Stutz, great guy. So that was the beginning. Then the association grew and grew, and so they moved it to Chicago. They moved it to what was called the Public Administration Center, which from the standpoint of history is an extremely important development in the enhancement of state and local government effectiveness, both the political side and the professional managerial side. At this public administration center was part of the University of Chicago, and it was fostered by a great dean there who succeeded in getting a wonderful building built. And the organizations there were the associations of city managers, city finance directors, city public works directors, tax assessment officials, city planners. So it was a beehive of activity. Now, none of those organizations had more than one, maybe two employees, because all these associations were just beginning. They were just beginning to think about this work as being professional, rather than being some people chosen like I was chosen in the clerk of the municipal court's office in Chicago.
Excuse me, was this the building that's referred to as 1313?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And so this is in downtown Chicago, or is this on the University of Chicago
That's
campus?
the University of Chicago. It's 1313 East 60th Street, so it's 60 blocks south from the center of Chicago.
Okay.
And why is it coming about in Chicago at that time, considering it's kind of, you know, staring in the face of the beast?
That's a good question. The reason is so often the case in the development of these institutions, it was one man, a Mr. Merriam, whose son, incidentally, later on became one of the mayors of Chicago. And he, with others, but his primary leadership got this started. And rallied the troops around his enthusiasm and his ability to raise money and get things done.
Mm-hmm. Was Roger Dunn involved in this?
No,
Person
I
you had
have
originally
no
met?
idea what happened to Roger. I only had that one contact with him.
Huh.
But I'm sure he was very successful. He was a very bright guy.
Was the work that all these associations doing integrated into the work at all at the University of Chicago, or were they just
Yes,
a
to some
vehicle?
extent. Now, by that time, of course, the association, ICMA, the City Managers Association, had a new director, a man named Ridley. Ridley had his master's from Syracuse. Very well-educated man, and a very savvy man. And so he was the leader of the group in Chicago. And the heads of all of these other associations, of course, they were closely allied. And getting back to my consulting work, each of them would from time to time get asked to do some consulting work, like the Finance Officers Association for cities might be asked to help a city reorganize their financial management methods. And they just couldn't do it. They were not staffed to do it, not set up to do it. So all the associations got together and they started an organization called Public Administration Service, which is the consulting firm that I went to work for at the end of the war. And so the headquarters of that organization was established there at 1313 East 60th Street. So it was in a way a service organization for these others who couldn't or didn't want to get into the consulting business.
How big was the firm? How many employees? How few?
Well, there were probably 30 or 40 of us spread around the country and to some extent around the world. And they were a very, very successful organization. And again, I got to know those fellows. Again, what's common? I guess in thinking about it now, we had to have been risk takers because we had to travel with our families whenever we had a new assignment, with or without family. I always took mine. You go out and you enter into a totally unknown environment in the city or in the state capital or in the Bonneville Power Administration, which is a federal agency, still is, that built the Cooley Dam and the Bonneville Dam and so on, and other dams along the Columbia River and are still operating them. And I would often get assigned to analyze the engineering type jobs or to recommend how they might reorganize them. One time after I became, several times after I became an active manager in some of these cities, which we'll talk about later, this organization, Public Administration Service, would call me up and say, Mark, could you get away for a week or whatever to go to Portland, Oregon, or to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or what? And if I could work my calendar around, then I did some of that too. So I maintained contact with them. And incidentally, the man who ran that organization was one of the real geniuses and he was a mentor.
Who was that?
His name was Herman Pope, P-O-P-E. And he's just one of those guys. Well, for instance, again, this is not too long.
No?
Okay, we haven't gotten anywhere yet.
We have a long way to go.
Yeah, well, when I got out of the service, I went down to Purdue, still in uniform. I hadn't gotten any clothes. My wife was in, and the one child in Chicago. I went down to Purdue to meet with the vice president of the university named Bob Stewart, who had been a good friend of mine when I was at Purdue. It just happened that I was the president of our fraternity and he was the national president of the fraternity at the same time. So that brought us together. And so I went back down just to chat with him, and he talked about what I might be interested in and so on. And he said, well, you go talk to this man, Herman Pope, at 1313 East 60th Street, and I think he is doing the kind of thing you would be interested in.
What did you think you would be interested in at that time?
Okay. I was telling him that I found I was definitely interested in government and that I thought I could do management, that I could handle a management job. Mm-hmm. And that was probably essentially it. And so that fit the pattern of public administration service. So he sent me down and I got an interview with Herman Pope. Mm-hmm. And when he learned that I was from Purdue, he got very interested because he had gone to Purdue. And then he wanted to know all about, was I in ROTC? And I told him, yeah, all about that. And then he wanted to know all about my war career. And he had been too old to be called in. So we never did talk about the job. Until we had chatted like this for a couple of hours. And so then he offered me a job. Hmm. I didn't know anything about the work, really.
So he was just getting to know you and having you reveal who you were. And
yes. And this, I found myself, incidentally, to inject it into the mm-hmm. present discussion. Mm-hmm. I found myself in later years following the kind of intuitive decision-making mm-hmm. that he obviously did at that mm-hmm. point. He didn't hire me because I'd been in the ROTC or because I'd been in the military, but probably just because the way we communicated mm-hmm. and the way the feeling he got for me, mm-hmm. For whatever, intelligence enough to handle this kind of work. Mm-hmm. Where you're wandering into an organization where all of them know everything there is to know about the organization, and you have to tell them what's wrong with the way they're organized and make them go for it. That was a great experience.
Did you continue to use that kind of interviewing style when you hired people as a manager or with ICMA?
Yes. I would, of course, study their resume and ask them about that. Mm-hmm. But it was so much the feeling mm-hmm. that here's a person, man or woman, that can fit into our organization, can work with me.
So today we call this a fit, right?
Yeah,
it's a fit.
Yeah, fit.
What were some of the...
Not this kind of a fit, but
right.
that kind of a
What were some of the guiding ideals and principles at that time that Herman Pope and others were probably working by that enabled him to see in you a good candidate to be involved in the profession?
Herman was a man of the highest ethics and ideals, and that was evident in what he said and the way he said it. He was dedicated to improving government. Mm-hmm. And he had set up this, well, he hadn't set it up, but he was running this organization because of that. Because he knew he was doing good. And all the government organizations out there realized it because of the effectiveness of the consulting work that he was managing. In those days, it wasn't that common for a government to want to have outsiders come in, intruding into their operation and trying to tell them what to do.
And was the impetus for the government to open up and ask for that sort of advice more about efficiency or more about really wrestling with democracy or representative government or just good service? Was it really about engineering your way to good government, or was it about tackling some democratic ideals?
It was more to make the organization work better, efficiency and effectiveness. It was more of that. We were not so much called in to recommend a policy in terms of social policy. Local governments and states and feds to a considerable extent weren't yet deeply involved in the welfare kind of program, the social service programs. Particularly at the local government, they were service organizations. They were set up and they took over these responsibilities because there was no way that a private business could make a profit at it. Or they couldn't make a profit, nor did they want to handle all the headaches involved in that kind of work. For instance, zoning, building inspection, people that are developing property or building facilities, they don't like to have inspectors coming around telling them what to do. And so that's hardly something you can make a profit at doing. And furthermore, the public interest has to be represented by the inspectors. So the cities take over jobs like that. And so when they have a consultant come in, wanted to know how in the world can we do this better, more effective, not have so many headaches with people, not spend so much money because we're very short on money. So that's the kind of work we were doing. And that was typical of what city managers were doing then. That still is a big part of their job now. But it was a total job at that time. City councils, that's what city councils and mayors were worried about. And geez, they get so many complaints about garbage collection, union strikes, police brutality. They want somebody that some way they can manage that operation better. It's a tiger in many ways to lead it and control it and direct it in such a way that it's really providing good, efficient, fair service. And so that's what we were doing in our consulting, to get back to that.
Then you went on to become city manager. Where was the next stop?
Well,
Wisconsin, I believe.
So we've discussed the consulting and Wichita. Incidentally, about Wichita, that was my first contact with the University of Kansas city management master's degree program. And let me just say a little bit more about that. Started out there in the middle of the country by a man named Dr. Ethan Allen, who was the most savvy academic I think I've ever known. He somehow got dedicated to developing local government managers. I don't know how it happened. But he had the kind of moxie so that he could sell it within the university structure, which, as you know, is not always easy. Sell a new master's degree program and to draw the resources that it takes to get it started. And so I got to know him quite well. I almost went to work for him, but it has evolved and improved and developed. So now it is by far the best city management training program in the country. And back to after Wichita, by that time, our first son became evident, had some kind of problem in his development. And no place we went to in the Kansas area could answer the question or do anything about it. So we wanted to get back into the Chicago-Milwaukee area, partly to be close to my parents for a change, but mostly to find some place where Mark could be diagnosed and possibly helped. So we did get him to the clinic at the University of Chicago. We did get some idea of what his problems were. We did get him into a special institution in the Chicago area. That was actually started with the Kennedy family money for handicapped children. And so that's why we went to that area. So in the Milwaukee area, I was city manager of Shorewood, Wisconsin, which is a North Shore suburb of Milwaukee on the same border. And that's a very good place to get started, to figure out how it is, what it feels like to run that kind of an organization.
How big was the city?
It's 15,000.
Okay.
And did they already have a city manager and you were coming to replace, or were you?
Yes, he retired, so I was replacing him. And he had apparently done a good job. He was an engineer. They had an assistant city engineer. So when I came, I had my engineering registration in the state of Kansas. I had arranged for that after the war because of my degree. Not because I knew anything about engineering, but because I had a degree in it. And so when they hired me in Shorewood, they said, geez, we get two jobs filled with one guy, the same as we had before. So I didn't mislead them about it, but I'm sure that's what they bought, what they thought they were buying. And so the assistant city engineer turned out was a good technician, but nothing more than that. So I had to learn a lot about engineering and who to hire and how to get something done. Then after 3 years, I got a call from the mayor of Oak Park, Illinois. He had just been elected with a whole new city council. They had just adopted the council manager form, and he wanted me to come down there for an interview to be the city manager. And I said, thank you, sir, but I've got too much going on here, and I've only been here for 3 years. So he said, thank you, goodbye. Well, then, about a month later, I got a call from Herman Pope, the guy we were talking about a little while ago that was really a great mentor. And he said, Mark, I understand that the mayor of Oak Park called you. And I said, yes. And he said, well, I understand that you refused to go up for an interview. And I said, yeah. I said, that's what I told him, because, you know, I just got too many important things to do here. And there was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. And he said, well, Mark, don't you think there's somebody else that could carry on that work? And so I couldn't say no.
Mm-hmm.
There ain't nobody can do this. So that made me think about it.
Mm-hmm. What were the qualities, do you think, that Herman Pope and whoever called you from Oak Park, the mayor, what did they think that you could bring to that situation? How did they think that that was a fit and they wanted to pursue you?
Well, it remains a mystery to me. It's not that I know so much, but that I do study very hard on what I decide I need to know. But I'm not a walking encyclopedia. I study what I need at a given time. So there must be something about the personality, about the maybe it's a sense of confidence is a big part of it. Mm-hmm. You know, even in watching presidential candidates.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think a big part of the decision by voters as to which one of those 9 candidates they would vote for is based purely on personality. Mm-hmm. They don't care, or in many cases don't understand what they're talking about in terms of domestic policy, healthcare policy, economic policy, etc., or in foreign relations. But they do get a feel for that person. Is that somebody that I can trust? Is that somebody that is confident, that I can feel secure, knows what he's doing, is confident in what he's doing? And so I think it's the same way in your own relationships. And certainly in mine, in picking people that I wanted to work with me.
So it's much more a question of personal integrity versus background and particular knowledge?
Yes, it is with me.
Mm-hmm. So you look for somebody then
well,
who
it's
can
a
learn?
little like picking a wife or a husband. I mean, you don't care that much about their education or whether they like opera or, well, you know, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
You get a feel for them.
Yeah. But it's a different, if you could talk a little bit about the kind of integrity or the kind of personality for public service as opposed to for business or for politics.
Yeah, well, that's...
What are the characteristics of a public servant, public administrator?
Of course, I guess maybe the first thing I look for is what I would call attitude. By the time I got into hiring anybody in the field, which really wasn't until Oak Park, Shorewood was fairly routine, although it was a big learning experience for me because I knew so little. But it was not a period for making any big changes or for hiring people. So starting in Oak Park, I looked for a dedication to, you know, an attitude that says, boy, I really want to work in local government. I really think local government is important. And then, of course, yes, I do know a lot about it in this, at least in this particular regard. Like the fellow I hired when I first went to Oak Park as the director of finance, I did that because I got the council to approve the job. They didn't even have such a job. They had a bookkeeper. And this was a city of 60,000 population, the largest suburb of Chicago. You see how many opportunities there were if for a fellow like me in those days, when organization of government or business was not anywhere near the degree of sophistication that it is now. Public and the customers didn't demand it as much as they do now. The public is so sophisticated now.
Was it an all-male dominated profession at that time?
Yes, yes. So I hired Harris Stevens from Milwaukee. He was assistant to the controller of the city. Had a master's degree in public finance, I believe, and just a highly ethical guy in his personal life and in his work. And so I got him on board, and so he solved all those problems that we had of financial management. So back to your question, what was it appealed to me? I had gotten to know him in Shorewood, and so I knew him personally as a guy of the integrity that I would require to work with me, and the knowledge and the dedication. He had the right attitude.
I hate to belabor this point, but if just back to that question about, you talk about people wanting to work hard to make a difference. How would you say that that's different than somebody with political ambitions? They're interested also in local government, but to come at it from another way. So can you talk about the relationship between those kinds of people? Or how you see them as similar or
yes, that's
different?
a very good question. Well, let me take a specific political person. That is with my direct experience, the mayor of Oak Park. First time he'd ever held political office. He was an attorney. He had not managed anything, as far as I know. He practiced law in his own law firm. He ran for office because the previous city government of Oak Park was literally corrupt. It was apparently as bad as the Chicago city government, a carbon copy of it in terms of corruption and inefficiency.
And would the corruption be at both levels with politicians and management?
Yes.
Okay.
It pretty much have to. The corrupt politician will almost force it down into the organization. Same way that an honest one will, may take a little longer maybe, but it'll change the attitude of the employees. Russ Christensen, the mayor, was he had the right attitude about his job, that his job was not to be the manager of the organization. That's my job as a city manager. He was the leader of he was the image of the city to the public, to the 60,000 citizens. He was the one that was there to make them feel satisfied about their government. And he was a terrific guy at it. And it was his job also to bring in ideas about what he had learned they wanted, changes that they wanted. And he and the council then would make a policy on it and turn me loose to solve it. Of course, since I was working at it 24 hours a day practically, I often knew the problems before they did and would help them discover the problem and then help them decide what to do. Very, very interesting relationship between the manager and the mayor council.
So you're invisible to the public, but you make the character that is visible look very good to the public. You
That's
support them?
almost true. But in the city of Oak Park, which is actually called the Village, it was impossible to remain invisible. And because the public, they wanted to know you. They wanted to know, who is this
Who's
guy?
running it?
Particularly since it was a new form of government. They'd never had such a thing as a city manager.
Oh, so you're the first city manager?
Oh, yes, I was the first one. They had just adopted the city manager form of government, and that's a very interesting political story about how it happened.
So this is a big reform movement, and why you're really brought in is
Big reform. Yes, and while you raise that question, let me take off on that, because it was not only reform in Oak Park, it was reform in the state of Illinois. And somebody should write the history of that. What a wonderful field you're in. And so if you were to study something like that, you'd be able to answer the question about why it happened in Illinois at that time. We're talking about what year? 1953. 53, I went to Oak Park. That's 8 years after the war. Illinois had just gotten so bad in its local and state government. The governors, you know, some were sent to prison, one anyhow. And downstate Illinois was as corrupt as the Chicago area. And so not only Oak Park, but about 20 to 25 major cities and small ones in the state of Illinois did the same thing. And it was not just in deciding to pick a city manager, that's secondary. The primary thing was that people like the mayor I'm discussing, Mayor Christensen, decided that, by God, they were going to do something, even though they had never been in politics before. So up and down the state, from Oak Park to Evanston, to Decatur, to Peoria, to Springfield, all around the state, Joliet, they started with a referendum. They had to get the public to vote for it. And they managed to get these things passed. They managed to get the, quote, good guys elected. And then they managed to approve the council manager form and then hire a manager.
Could you put Illinois in the context of the rest of the country? Is Illinois pioneering at this point, or are they following examples already set in other states?
It's very interesting to study. I've never done it in an academic sense, but intuitively to watch what happens so differently in different states. Take Virginia, for instance. Virginia has always been, since I've had contact with them, a state that lives in tradition and high ethics. Undoubtedly, you could find exceptions. And they were in the vanguard of adopting the council manager form. The first city to officially adopt something like the council manager form was in Virginia.
Right.
And it remains that way. You don't read much at all about corruption in local government in Virginia. And so not only the cities, but most the counties have managers, professional managers, as I was. Then jump across the country to California. Same way there. All through the state, with, of course, exceptions in Los Angeles. I shouldn't say of course, because it's a much more complex matter than that. In Los Angeles and San Francisco, they don't have city managers. Discuss that later if you want to. So there's two states, to get to your question, that have been, from the very beginning, strong with council manager form of government. Then you go to a state like, Kentucky. There are some cities in Kentucky that have the council manager form, but not many. And in New Jersey, in Mississippi, Louisiana, etc.
But in general, the reform movement and the council manager form of government was picking up at that time after the war.
Yes, actually, it's a very amazing phenomenon, what happened, which was its big growth after the war, even though it had started in 1914. It's an amazing phenomenon that there was such reform power, and it had to start with the citizens throughout local government. Who was that? Stephens, at the turn of the century, that wrote a book called, I shouldn't have mentioned it if I didn't, I can't remember, but he wrote a book that had a great impact on local government even back then. So this, back to council manager form, it was an amazing development in the United States, and which we may get to later. It has been picked up by many foreign countries now.
At what point, I asked you before and you talked a little bit about it, mostly being the impetus coming from efficiency and for running a government, the infrastructure. So was the social infrastructure starting to show up in '53 when you get to Oak Park, or is it still mostly efficiency and hardware?
Still mostly that. Examples of for example, what did I get into, and what did the city council get into? Well, the Oak Park, even though it's called Oak, is full of elm trees, and Dutch elm disease. Tell me when to slow down or abbreviate.
Okay.
Because I'm going much longer than I had any anticipation doing. But the trees were being hit with Dutch elm disease, the Dutch elm bark beetle. And if that town would have lost its elm trees, it wouldn't have been the same town at all. And the whole economy, the whole nature of the town would have been ruined. Well, the way I learned about it is when I first became manager, I'd be going around to every part of the organization, every part of the city, to see what's going on. And so I went down to the Public Works office. It was crummy, dirty kind of a joint. And there was one fellow sitting up against the wall and a little table in front of him, and then on the wall were a series of nails sticking out, and each nail had a title on it. Holes in the street, water leaks, sewer problem, et cetera, et cetera. And each one had, a reasonable number on it, 1 or 2 or 3, which meant that they were probably taking care of these things. Whereas one over here had a whole flock. There was, a nail was hardly long enough to hold them. And it said trees on top of it. And so I said to the guy there, I said, why? And I called his boss over, the street superintendent. Why is it you have all these here? He said, well, we don't have any money to do anything. I said, well, geez, what do you tell people when they call up? Well, we just tell them, sorry, we can't take care of it. And so that wasn't their fault. So I talked to council about it, and so they decided, let's go. So, okay, as soon as they said, let's go, then I got on the ball. Where do you get the money to do it? That's the first thing. So we started a vehicle license fee. Wasn't popular, but it was $10 or $15 a year, but it raised the money. to do the job. I got on the horn. I found where Michigan State University had the best program in training urban foresters. And so I called up at East Lansing is where Michigan State is. I called my manager friend of East Lansing. He was the city manager there. Said, help me find a guy. So he called me back in a couple of days and he said, I've got the guy. So I said, send him down to see me, and he came down and I hired him. He was in the city forester, Tom Greeley.
So was that the first time that you kind of seized on an opportunity? It presented itself. As you read the situation, it was pretty obvious something needed to be done, but you had to take a risk, convince others,
right,
and lead through a problem.
Yeah, well, that's why it's a good example. It's all of what you said, and it was about the first time that I got that exhilaration. You know, hot dog. This is a real winner, and I know how to do it. And so we did it, and we even sprayed trees with DDT, which of course they wouldn't allow you to do in the last 25 years. But this is back in 50s. Oh, incidentally, the city manager of Oak Park called me about 6 months ago, and he said, Mark, we're going to have a celebration, and we'd like to have you come. I said, what are you celebrating? He said, we're celebrating 50 years since you started as city manager, as the first city manager. See, I started in 53, here we are in 03. I said, well, geez, that's a crazy idea. And he said, well, no, it's a good idea. And the public will get involved because they adopted the council manager form. So I said, sure, I'd be glad to come. So they paid the expenses of me and my wife to go there. They had a parade, a special parade on 4th of July. They made me the parade master with my wife and the city manager riding around.
How are the oak trees doing?
What?
How are the oak trees doing?
The trees?
Yeah.
Oh, the trees are fine now, but we did not eradicate the problem. They still have problem with it, but the trees are there. They're beautiful. As the parade went down the street, I just love to see those trees that are still there, arching over the streets. So that's kind of a very pragmatic problem, and I could name a lot of others. There was not a problem with the city council did not feel it was their responsibility to take care of the poor people. They didn't feel it was their responsibility to solve the public health problem. They didn't feel it was their responsibility, you know, for all those social problems.
But you had your first experience with a city behind you, wrestling with its identity, being tied up in an oak tree, and successfully managing that situation.
Sure. So, and of course, city manager has to do that in such a way that the city council feels that they started it and that it's to their credit. And let me right now emphasize that very fundamental point. The manager is there not to show off about how he's a manager and he can save money and he can do things more effectively. That's what you learn. That's what you're paid for. That's how you come up through the system. If you can't do that, you shouldn't be a manager. And it's hard for a manager not to get carried away by that, like a corporate chairman and president. He's the big shot. Nobody knows anything about the corporate board, right? Until lately now they're getting interested in governance of private corporations. We're interested from day one in governance, which means that the policies, the company is really run by the board, the elected board. This is democratic representative system. And the manager who doesn't understand that and very carefully work with that attitude will not be successful. So I've never had any trouble doing that. Sometimes, of course, some councilmen doesn't feel he or she getting enough credit for what they're doing. And so, and some you just can't satisfy,
Okay.
as in anything else.
I think we're at a good point to just take a break for a moment.
Okay?
Let's kind of assess where we are.
Yeah.
We could go on for
Because we
real
would just
long
go
time.
on to Tucson. Yeah.
I'm
There's an
a little
answer.
concerned about the cruise time. We're off now, right? I'm just concerned about the cruise time and how much more we should go on with you, and is Jack here waiting, and so on and so forth. Yes, I was. I think I've been wearing them the whole time.
Yes.
Okay? We're gonna transition from Oak Park to Tucson.
Sure.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So we need to know how you got there and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Did you need some more water or anything?
No, I'm
Okay.
fine, thanks.
They got one. She's got some.
Thank you.
Before the break, we were just sort of wrapping up the story of your kind of early first success in Oak Park. So let's move on to the transition in your career to Tucson. And how was it you left Oak Park in '62 for Tucson?
So I'd been in Oak Park for 9 years, and it didn't seem as challenging as it had been. There didn't seem to me so many hot issues like the elm trees, where you get really excited about making change. The staff was in very good shape. And the headhunters started having cities call, see if I'd be interested. And so I was agreeing yes in a few cases to go. For instance, one that I went to was Spokane. I thought Spokane would be great. But they appointed a manager from Texas that would fit their situation better than I would. And then Dade County, Florida, which is the biggest city manager jurisdiction in the country, had me down among 3 finalists without ever having filed an application or been interviewed. And they appointed another guy who was excellent. And so then with Tucson, it's interesting. I mentioned that this Herman Pope used to contact me once in a while and say, could you spend a week here or there? Well, he called me when I was in Oak Park and he said, would you like to go to Phoenix? I said, yeah. And I said, what do you have there? And so he described it. And so I went down, spent a week in Phoenix on a project involving the police department.
This is Phoenix. This is here.
Pardon me?
We're talking about Phoenix now?
Phoenix, yeah.
Just on a consulting job.
On this consulting job, just for consulting in the police department. And so I did that, incidentally recommending that the police get paid 10% more than the firemen, which caused a big uproar, of course. And the city adopted it. I think city adopted a 5% difference. I just have such a tremendous respect for police officers and the job, more fundamentally, the responsibility they have and the knowledge, abilities, and skills it takes to do that police job. So while I was here on that project, I learned that Tucson was looking for a city manager, that they had just fired a guy named Porter Homer, who was a very good manager, but he'd been fired. So I called up the mayor of Tucson And he said, well, I'm going to be in Phoenix the next day or two. How about lunch? So we had lunch. His name was Lou Davis. He's a Republican. Now, Tucson, I learned, was the only city in Arizona that had partisan, avowedly on the ballot, national party politics. And secondly, that they were, I think, still the only one that had ward elections, with councilmen coming from wards. And both of these, of course, are tough elements in the total governance structure for the manager. But that stirred my interest, really, that I would get that kind of experience. And so the mayor said after lunch, well, why don't you come on down when you're finished with this job, and you can meet the city councils individually, because he said we haven't even gotten applications in yet. So I did that and went around and individually talked to all the councilmen and went on home.
What was your impression of Tucson at that point? Had you been to Arizona or Tucson before?
I had only been to Arizona when I got off the Army train in Yuma after Louisiana maneuvers and the train ride all the way across that interminable Texas. Got off in Yuma and went out into the desert in an Army truck. So that's the only time I'd been to Tucson before. I'd been to Arizona. And yeah, I was excited at the possibility of moving to Arizona and talked to my wife, and she was too. So
what was it about the state at that time that made it an exciting possibility?
Well, all that image about the Great West, we had never, well, we had lived in Portland for a short time while I was a consultant there. But particularly the Southwest, the climate, you know, all the stuff that appeals to people here still does to me.
And the political situation?
Well, the political situation I didn't know anything about really, except I knew they had fired Porter Homer, whom I knew very well, and I knew he was a good manager. And I learned that it was for partisan reasons, mainly, although there might have been other reasons too. But when he was hired by the Democrats, yeah. He was hired while the Democrats had the majority. And then the Republicans got the majority in '62. And they fired Porter partly because they thought he was a Democrat. But actually, he was more a Republican. So they probably had other reasons.
How did you know him? Did you work with him professionally, or just knew him
I knew him
casually?
professionally. In like so many other professions, you get together with your peers whenever you can to learn from them and just to tell your own war stories. And in the conferences at the state level and national level. And by that time I had been a vice president of ACMA, and so that gave me more opportunity to get to know other city managers. So I had gotten to know him and respect him. So I saw all the councilmen one at a time, and then I'm not sure I ever had an interview with them as a group. At any rate, the next thing, after I got home in Oak Park, maybe a month later, they sent 2 councilmen to Oak Park to check me out on the ground. And they did quite a thorough job. They went around, talked to the rabbi, they talked to the Catholic pastor, they talked to all kinds of people. business and everything else. And shortly after that, they offered me the job. I was at a conference at the University of Illinois, and we were all the Illinois managers were in the dining room for lunch, and I got word that the mayor of Tucson was on the phone, wanted to talk to me. So I said, "Where's the phone?" They said, "Well, it's right there," and it's practically in the room, where all my buddies were. And so they knew that it was the mayor of Tucson and that I was an applicant there. So I got on the phone. The mayor said, "Well, we're offering you the job." I said, "That's great. Now tell me what the vote was." And he said it was unanimous. And I said, "No, okay, now tell me what the vote was before you all made it unanimous." He said it was a 5-2. I said, "Well, that's pretty good. Now, who were the two that?" and when he told me who they were, well, they were the ones I would have expected, wouldn't have voted for a guy like me. So I said, "Okay, I'll take it." I don't think I even asked for salary. That's the way the profession kind of was in those days. At least that's the way I was. And I think most of the managers were that way. We were just beginning to think about our own welfare. Now this sounds kind of silly, but I think it's true. And so it took a while for us to catch on that you ought to really look out for yourself and not just be thinking about the good of the city all the time. So that's how, to answer your question, how I got started in Tucson. And my wife was enthusiastic about it, and by that time we had 8 kids. And so we loaded up in our equivalent of a Volkswagen bus with the dog and the 8 kids, and off we went.
What was the challenge at that time that you thought would lay ahead in Tucson? Like in the arc of your career, you'd had the 9 years in Oak Park. You felt pretty confident about how you would handle things there. Sounds like you were coming into a wildly different kind of situation in Tucson.
Well, actually, as I reflected on that question and from time to time, it was, as I said a moment ago, the challenge. This is something brand new, to be in partisan politics, because that's what most of the country is made of, and try ward elections. In a large city, it's finally up in the 250,000 category, whereas I had been in 15,000 and 60,000. And I was thoroughly convinced that what you learn and what you have a potential of accomplishing is somewhat proportional to the size of the city. It's not necessarily true, but that's what I felt. I had an ambition to be in a large city, to see the way things work in a large city other than Chicago.
But even though you were sort of on a trajectory of council management, but you were going to move into a situation with a partisan situation. Yes. So did that give you pause, or was that also something that you wanted the experience of? Well,
the council manager forum doesn't require nonpartisanship, and it doesn't require that the mayor be elected by the city council, even though that is part of the preferred way. I guess it's still part of the preferred way, even though most mayors are directly elected now anyhow. But in at that time, there were still more in transition. So yeah, I thought it'd be a great experience, and the family thought it would be great to live down there, and so off we went.
So tell us what happened when you were in Tucson.
Well,
try to paint for us a picture of '62 in Tucson, and what you're walking into.
The shining light was Lou Davis, the mayor, for me. Like every mayor, there were some people who didn't like him, of course, but for me, he was great. He was very good for the city. He was very dedicated to what was good for the city. And he would think and study pretty carefully what he thought was good for the city. But he was a Republican, and the politics were shifting to the Democrats. When I accepted the job, the Republicans were a clear majority, and over the 4 years I was there, it shifted to a Democratic majority. But when I left, Lou Davis was still the mayor. And in 1964, 2 years after I got there, I was elected president of ACMA. That's the elected president from the membership. And it's just a part-time representational role. I remember the city council gave me a suitcase to celebrate my election. And so when I accepted the suitcase, I hope this doesn't have any significance about a permanent trip. And so things were always very friendly. It was a great city council, but as Jack Tobolsky said, there was one councilman who later became mayor who didn't like the whole idea of having a city manager kind of interfering with the political way he liked to operate. And furthermore, he himself obviously wanted to be mayor. When he ran for election to become a councilman, he was not on the council when I was hired. He took on the police chief. That if he was elected, he was going to fire the police chief. Well, the chief and I didn't pay much attention to it. I didn't worry about it until he got elected. So then the new councilman made a move, but he couldn't get anywhere with it. I was just totally with the chief, and that if they wanted to get him, they'd have to take me. And the chief was absolutely outstanding. He lives here in Phoenix now. When he was after he was in Tucson for I don't know, 7, 8 years, he was hired as a police chief in Miami. And they can afford the best. They were still a fairly good government in those days. And so he's just a great chief, a great guy. I'll see him probably after I get done with Jack Tobolsky at lunch.
And what was the conflict there between the councilman and the chief?
Probably that the chief wouldn't do what this councilman wanted in the way of political favors. This councilman made the national newspapers when he was in Washington at a city conference where some member of the staff of the National League of Cities accused him of trying to make her. And one of the great columnists at that time wrote a story about him. Another time he was picked up in Tucson because he had a gal in his lap as he was driving around at night. He was very popular. He's an effective politician. He knew what to say and when to say it and where to say it, and how to handle the press. So he could get the votes, obviously. He got elected. So he felt himself an independent power, and that his future was being the mayor, and that's what he succeeded doing. When I left, I really didn't think he had any chance of ever becoming mayor. Thought the public would see through him the same as I had. Incidentally, he tried to get us to hire certain kinds of engineering consultants that he apparently had some contact with. I had no solid evidence. I don't know what I would have done if I did have the solid evidence, who I would have talked to, but the mayor and I might have done something. At any rate, that's the beginnings and some of the essence of Tucson. Now, what did I do there that was so satisfying? Well, they had determined to improve the previous mayor was Don Hummel, incidentally, who was very well known nationally. And he had been the president of the National League of Cities. So while he was mayor, they had tried to get the voters to approve an urban renewal project to redevelop the downtown. The downtown had gotten pretty bad shape, like so many downtowns do. And the public voted against it. And so Hummel was no longer the mayor. They'd fired the city manager, but they still wanted to do this. So here was a new opportunity. That's one reason I took the job. Because, okay, so they lost once, now we're going to win. So I hired 3 guys. I hired a new finance director. Our finance organization was terrible. So I made him assistant city manager for finance and administration. He had been working for IBM in Southern California as a sales representative, and he knew computers, and the computer system was all screwed up. They had only recently installed IBM equipment, but they couldn't get it to work until they finally sent out water bills, and the water bills were really in a mess. If you normally would have had a water bill for $15, this one might have been $150 or $500 or whatever. And so that's what it was when I got there. And I said, well, where's your paper backup material? Well, we didn't keep backup material. We threw that out. So they had depended on the new computer system without realizing that it probably wouldn't work at first, and therefore they'd have to stay with the paper system. So that was a major problem. So we got that straightened out. Jack Urish, wonderful, wonderful finance guy, and in many other ways. Then I hired the director of city planning from the city of Milwaukee. I had not known him before, named Vincent Lung, L-U-N-G, Chinese. Before I hired him, I talked to the head of the association, the National Association of Planners, whom I knew very well. You see, these are very important people to know. And we liked each other, respected each other. And I said, who should I hire? And he told me this guy. So I hired him. Third thing I did in the way of a top appointment was the water director of Tucson was a wonderful guy, a lovable kind of a guy, and he did an adequate job with the water. But there was no sign of forward looking. And in a city like Tucson, of course, you got to. And he wasn't thinking strategically in terms of region and state and national opportunities. So I persuaded him to retire. He was, I don't know, 67, 8 years old. And I hired the guy who had been the water system director for San Diego and had just retired. And I called him, and he didn't want to come. So I flew out there and stayed at their house, he and his wife. And so he agreed to come to Tucson because he could see that might be fun. So those three, the water system director, the finance director, and with the planning guy, I organized a new department of community development. In those days, that kind of a department hardly existed. But I put everything in there that related to development, economic planning, physical planning and zoning, building inspection, that kind of stuff.
And where had that model been adopted before?
I don't know. There were some cities that had it, but just a handful. But I don't
So
claim
you were going on a...
I don't claim to ever have a brand new idea. I'd almost always stole it from somewhere else.
But you thought that was the appropriate thing to install
Absolutely.
for Tucson at that time?
Yes, and what that involved, or what I made it involve, was the fact that we had a combined county and city planning department, which theoretically is great. But the planning director of this combined department was showing no allegiance to the city or cooperation with me, working only with the county. So I reorganized him out. If he loved the county so much, he could go to work for the county, and we'd split the department, and I'd hire the guy that would run it the way I wanted to run it. And so I didn't throw him out of a job, even though I sure knocked his ego. I didn't make him happy.
Could you talk a little bit about, it sounds like you're tackling some very different issues and on a bigger scale, so you'd already honed somewhat of a management style, but could you talk a little bit about how you actually were able to install and execute and carry out these changes?
Well, of course, I had to know that the council was with me on the concept of what I was going to do, and to agree that we had to have a water department that was forward-looking, that we had to have a man in the planning and development field who could help us work through the development that we had in mind. The mandate to me was to get urban renewal passed, to get downtown redevelopment going, and the convention center as part of the redevelopment. And, of course, to get the financial management straightened out. So they knew those were the problems. And so I knew what I had to do was to hire the right guys, so I got them to approve whatever reorganization was necessary, and to understand that I was the guy that was going to hire. I was going to pick the three that were going to do that. Now, after I had done 3 appointments of people outside of Tucson to come in and take high-paying jobs, the things got a little rough, because there was the city was somewhat, well, more than somewhat provincial. That what's wrong with people that live here? Why don't you point to people that live here and give them the high-paying jobs? So the council had some of that to worry about. And I got the feeling they wouldn't be real happy if I went for a number 4 change of that magnitude. So I stopped with those 3, and that's all I needed really to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. And so off we went. Yuri got the finance straightened out. We got the council to approve a citizens committee headed up by the best citizen activist I ever worked with.
Who was that?
It'll come to me. Roy Drachman. Roy Drachman.
Oh, sure.
You know Roy? Yeah. I don't know how you know him, but for the way I knew him, he was absolutely phenomenal as a citizen leader. He is a developer, of course. He was the president of the National Association of Shopping Centers. Very active in that field. And I don't think he even lived inside the city. And of course it was the council that made the appointment. I didn't make it, but I knew him and sure wanted him on there. And he became the chairman of the committee. So that was a big decision that the council made. So.
And I'm sorry, this is a citizens committee for what?
For, what do we call it? I don't know. For
Wasn't specifically
downtown
for,
redevelopment.
for downtown
Might
redevelopment.
have been, yeah.
Okay.
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
A specific task.
But it was
Yeah.
to look at the downtown renewal situation?
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. It must have been a title like that. And it must have been focused, it was focused on that. So we had to have a referendum that approved the whole idea of using federal urban renewal money and processes, because that's where we could get the capital money that we needed. We had a bond issue election, which had a dozen or more items on it for water improvements, sewer improvement, parks and recreation improvements, street improvements, anything that anybody wanted was on that list. Plus, in addition to the approval of urban renewal, there was some money for the convention center. Oh, for City Hall, new City Hall. The city had built a new City Hall, but only 1 story high. But it was designed so that the tower could be put up on it. So the money in this bond issue was for that tower. And we got the county involved so that they had a referendum to build new buildings, headquarter buildings for the county in Tucson, and to integrate all of that into our redevelopment plan, which Vincent Lung was doing. And he was terrific in conceptualizing, in organizing the staff, and bringing people along with him. He was a charming guy. And so his plan held up very well under council scrutiny, and they approved it, and the public voted for all these things that we asked them for. So there you are. It's like the trees. You got all the ducks lined up. You go. And so I left there before it was finished by any means, but everything was underway, full speed ahead. So that was the most satisfying thing there. And while that was all going on, I was president of ICMA for a year and had to travel quite a bit in connection with that, including over to Europe.
Well, let's move on and talk about ICMA. Is there something you wanted to follow up on, Tucson?
Well, how did you happen to leave Tucson? What's that transition? You went to HUD then?
Well, certainly it has to be partly due to the fact that I got fed up with this one councilman. Not just because of him, because of course a manager has to be able to tolerate one despicable character, if that's all he has on the council, or even 2 or 3. And so in the change of election, he had some allies. And I was confident, couldn't have gotten a majority vote if they wanted to set up a vote to fire me. I wasn't afraid of being fired, but I didn't want to stand for this hidden kind of opposition, short of going for a vote. So I felt that my opportunity for the kinds of changes that I had engineered in 4 years was pretty well disintegrated. That I could do all the routine stuff, minor changes, but that they weren't going to go for big changes. And to the extent that was correct. There's plenty to do in implementing all these things that have been approved by the public. But anyway, I felt the push to leave for that reason. Now, the pull, in other words, so where are you going? The pull came from Washington at that time. They said, we're starting this new Department of Housing and Urban Development, which had never existed before. Going to solve all the problems of the cities at once. You come help us. We need some guy who has been a recognized manager. You're the former president now. Come on here and we'll give you an assistant secretary job. So that was a pull. I knew some of the people that were in the top executive job, the undersecretary and assistant secretary. I'd gotten to know them. And so my wife and I decided, okay, it's time to go. So we went to Washington.
Before you go to Washington, I want to get back to a question, to a statement you made. You said you weren't afraid to be fired. And I'm just wondering, you're in a kind of a tenuous situation as a revolving city manager. You're working for bureaucracies that by this time have all kinds of benefits and stability, and yet you're coming in without any of those resources. So how were you able to get, I think you must have played a role in ICMA taking on some of that function of retirement and some sort of security issues for the people who are necessary to come make city management work, but aren't necessarily going to be there for a long time.
Okay, so what did we do in ICMA along that line?
Yeah.
Excuse me. Well, we started the ICMA Retirement Corporation, ICMA-RC. My boss then, of course, was the executive board of ICMA, which consisted of 15. We did have some women by that time on the board.
And what year is this that starts?
We are now in 1967 because I stayed with the feds as the assistant secretary for just 11 months. And that's the one job in my life I accepted and did and totally did not enjoy. So, when the executive director of ICMA announced his retirement and they started the recruitment process, selection process, I was asked by my friends on the board if I'd be interested. I did apply and they appointed me. Okay, that was in '67. So starting in '67, as we scoped out our objectives for the new leadership, the Retirement Corporation emerged as one of the hot to-dos, like the trees in Oak Park.
Okay.
And so I went after it and got it set up. The key to doing it was to get the House Ways and Means Committee under Wilbur Mills to support us enough so that the IRS would approve our plan. Now, why was that tricky? Because in effect we were inventing 401 plans that did not exist at that time. And so IRS was involved because it would include, obviously, deferred tax deferral. And so we got Wilbur Mills' support. And IRS then gave us a letter of approval to our plan. Now, of course, we hired a special attorney, special help in putting that together so that it was solid, it was sound, and approvable. So that was about the time that Wilbur Mills got caught with his girlfriend when she went swimming in the lagoon by the Jefferson Monument. But it held up, and so we got the Retirement Corporation started. And I ran it entirely out of my office for a year or so. Had one of my young, bright staff guys doing the work on it. But the reason it worked is because by that time I knew all the directors of these associations whose membership work for city managers. the city planners, the finance directors, the public works directors, and engineers, et cetera, et cetera. And so they were all interested, or I made them all interested in it. I made them part of it. And when our process would be trying to sell the cities and counties around the country to join the retirement plan, you had to get the approval of county boards and city councils, not just city managers. And so we had a network that was supporting it, and it began to sell. First opportunity for any employee, even in private business, to have a tax-deferred retirement plan. And from the standpoint of our managers and assistant managers and so on, who are in career patterns that take them to different cities, something like mine, they never would get vesting in any one of these plans because every state has a different plan. And most of them at that time, it took 10 years to get a right to any of those contributions. So this had that continuity, so that there was one plan that would cover you no matter where you worked, as long as it was in local government. And from the government standpoint, they would put their money in to cover the obligation for this or these ICMA members that wanted to belong. That's it. If the manager left, okay, so that went with him in his pot.
Interesting. Yeah.
So the city government saw it as a means of hiring and retaining top professional staff. So it was to their advantage, and that's why it sold. So anyhow, that's the kind of thing that was a big challenge in ICMA, the biggest single thing.
And did the city managers embrace this? Was it a hard sell or an easy sell?
It was a slow sell.
Okay.
And it's now phenomenal. You know, I don't know how many billions are in it now. And it's a staple, it's a standard. And then, of course, a few years later, the 401s and the 457s and everything else got started. So our plan is still surviving as of unique usefulness to our profession. And of course, in order to really make it successful, we had to make it open and available not only to city manager types, but to all local government employees. And that's really the decision that made it go.
That sort of brings up the question of length of service. Because it's been interesting to hear about your career and the amount of time it takes you to assess what the situation is and essentially do what you're brought there to do, but then you're moving on. So how would you balance the need to always be taking these risks and continuously changing things in a place, but not risking the actual stability of a city management?
Well, the main part of the answer to that question would be concern for family. That I sure didn't want to move in such a way that it would be bad for the family. It's very hard to estimate, of course, what the damage, if any, is going to be to a kid that's 5 years old, 10 years old, just a teenager. To some extent, my wife and I figured it was an advantage for them to move and get around and adapt to new environments. On the other hand, we knew that there's a lot of favor among parents for staying in the same place, so that kids they go to grade school with are the same as the ones they go to high school with, or in the same neighborhood, and that's true. So it from a family standpoint, is a very tough decision about moving. Now, don't misunderstand, the way I moved is by no means the case with all city managers. There are managers like a guy named Bob Morris at Glencoe, Illinois, who was there as manager. I attended his 25th anniversary party of being a manager when he got a bag of golf clubs, I think from the city council. Incidentally, he was later fired by a new city council. This is a suburb of Chicago. Very steady suburb, wealthy suburb. Even they got a city council that just wanted to change it, and they fired this guy who was a very good manager for 30 years or so. So by no means is everybody like me who moved that often. And so some of us, maybe you'd have to psychoanalyze that. Is it because of ambition? Well, certainly to a considerable extent it is. You know, does that mean that it's a mistake to be ambitious? Well, I don't think so. I think that cities and corporations need to have men and women that are risk takers, that want to go for the tough job. It's not as though I was going for a big salary. The most money I made as a city manager was in Tucson, and it was around $26,000 a year. But of course, that's 66, that's 40 years ago.
But that kind of risk-taking and moving probably did limit women from being involved in the profession in a way that it might not have limited men. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. But that was in the process of change too. And I'd like to mention that at ICMA, one of the things I am also very proud of is that we recognize that it was a male job. Also recognize that it's not we, ICMA, that decides who becomes a manager, but it's the mayor and the councils all over the country. And therefore, obviously, society is changing so that they are going to want to appoint blacks, Hispanics, women, at least those three, as their managers and as their top staff. The appointing authorities are going to want it. So I did it partly because I believed in it, but I did it mainly because it's a need of the profession. And we, as the ICMA, responsible for developing the competence, the availability of professionals who are willing to do this kind of a tough job, that we had to enhance the opportunities of women's, blacks, Hispanics to become city managers. And we did it. We got well, to the extent that any one organization can do it. We got the feds to put up money in those days that they would put up money for anything, almost, that you could sell them. So we got them to give money for minorities in management. We had a big national conference, brought in blacks. Here's a city manager profession. And then after we made good headway with blacks, we took on the women. By that time, my first wife had died. And so we appointed a committee, and we appointed as the chair of the committee the woman who is now my wife. She was a graduate of this great Kansas University program with a master's degree in city management. And she was at the academic field at the University of Georgia. She had been at the University of Kansas, responsible for local government official training all over the states in both of those. So she was the chair of this committee on women. Incidentally, when we had the opening meeting at a dinner of all the members of the committee, I had to get up and start the meeting and introduce her as the chairman. And I said, well, now I'd like to introduce the chairman of this committee on the role of women in the profession of management. It didn't even occur to me. See, that's we weren't sensitized. So of course she got up, and what'd she do? She threw a hardball at me. See that? Yeah, do you need any evidence of why we need this committee? Look at that guy. He's the head of the association, and he says chairman. Well, anyhow, so
Yeah.
I don't know. It's another digression.
No. Let's talk a little bit about how you've talked about how management and civil engineering is really the main focus, and so it seems like you're always taking advantage of a wonderful opportunity as it comes up and sort of shaping the next challenge you're going to take on. Can you talk a little bit about how, in general, ICMA and city managers are being trained, either through the Kansas program or elsewhere, to take on, other than infrastructure, more of the social infrastructure of a community? And when does that really kind of shift? So
well, that shift has been underway now for at least 50 years. It was a significant factor in manager appointments only in the very early days, from 1914 to the end of the war, maybe. And so it changed because the citizens were changing. They were better informed. The media, the change in the media, and the entree of television, so that this kind of stuff was out there in the news in all kinds of ways for the first time. So
when were city councils first covered by the media? Obviously, they were covered in the print forever, but when did the broadcast media come into effect, and what kind of an effect did that have on the city council, how government was run, by being so transparent to their communities?
Yes. Tucson was the first time that I was heavily contacted by the media. Before that, as a suburban city manager, we didn't have a daily newspaper to deal with. Although in Shorewood, the Milwaukee paper would come out, a guy named Wing, and he'd want stories from Shorewood and Oak Park. The Chicago Daily News or Tribune would be after me once in a while, but mostly, you know, they didn't hammer on us. When I got to Tucson, that's another aspect of a big city, which I coveted to have that experience. How could I handle it? And so in Tucson, we not only had two competitive newspapers, absolutely competitive, the Star and the Citizen. They've since combined at least partly. I don't know what the status is now. Anyhow, they were highly competitive newspapers, and each had to have a different point of attack. And there were an abundance of television and radio stations, and they all wanted their story. And so trying to deal with that, learning what I could about how to do it. The assistant manager I had there had been a reporter for the Daily Star, Arizona Daily Star. And so he had great sensitivity on press relations and pretty good with television and radio. So, you know, just like always, I don't know all these things by any means, and some guy has to take care of me, guy or gal. With ICMA, I had great staff, same way, that kept me out of trouble, almost.
How about the cable situation actually covering council? Was there an impact on it becoming so transparent to people that they could tune in and see what their elected officials were doing?
Well,
and how
actually, nearly all of that occurred after I left being a city manager, which is back in '66, 40 years ago. Most of the television coverage of city councils came after that. But so from ICMA, viewing standpoint and listening to managers talk about it, it tends to change the person, the council member, radically sometimes. That,
You mean by that who would come into it to be a council member, or?
Well, I'm thinking of the way any person behaves when he or she, he knows, is under close observation. Any of us are that way, even without television. Under close observation, our behavior, depending on the environment, will be quite different from our normal behavior. Now then, when you turn a camera on them, which is being broadcast to all the taxpayers and voters, I don't care who you are, you're going to act differently. And so some learn to use that to their political advantage, and some kind of refuse to join the game. And so you begin to get the separation of one kind of a person from the other in the political scene. And those that survive, if they want to survive in politics, they have to learn how to play that visibility game. Watch the 9 guys, gals and guys running for Democratic nomination. They've got to learn to deal, most of them have already tried to learn, and some of them are doing a lot better at it now than others, a lot better. So, in city council, yes. And some managers have told me that it really had a negative effect on the progress of the city. That it became, in some cases, councilmen would be too dominated by the need to project a favorable impression. Others say, well, they're just that way on television, but then, one-on-one, it's still okay to work with them. Depends on the people.
And what would the effect be of the shift from at-large to district?
Like in Phoenix?
Yeah. Or just from your experience across the country, when a place would go from at-large to district, a council member has to make that contact a lot more with their district through cable television.
Well, in terms of budgeting, allocating municipal resources, one has to be, from the management standpoint, careful that the benefits of these resources are being shared equally to some extent. And because that's what the councilman wants. He wants to be able to go home and say that whatever goodies that the city has to distribute, to make available on any kind of a discretionary basis, that I'm your boy, I'm getting our share. In fact, I'm getting more than our share. You talk to any congressman, you know that's what they live on. And that's why the national government particularly is so difficult, because they come from these relatively small districts where they've got to satisfy the voters in that particular area, no matter how much they wish they might be able to work on major national policies. So that's the way it gets with individual city council members. And sometimes it has a very deleterious effect on the total welfare of the whole community, because most of the important issues are way beyond ward elections. Many of them are beyond the city elections. They involve policies that relate to the whole region. And so it takes, if you're going to be a politician, somehow you have to be able to persuade your voters that what you're doing out here in the big picture is good for them, and that's not always easy. And it takes a great talent to do it. That's what makes a really great politician. And incidentally, before I lose the opportunity, I want to emphasize my basic philosophy about what a manager is. A manager is there to make that city council satisfied and happy that they are doing something useful, that they are successful, that they are good. And the manager has to be devoted to helping them do that. Yeah, it's the same way I look at staff. Staff isn't there just to operate like automatons. They are there because they have competence. They have ability of one kind or another, no matter how small it might be. And so you want your organization to be so arranged that they realize that they're doing something important and that they are getting recognized for it and that they're being treated fairly. Same way with the councilmen. They gotta feel that they're recognized. And the city manager has to treat some of them, you know, with kid gloves, because your sensitivity might be more or less than his or different from you.
Could we talk about that a little bit more in this sense? You called ICMA a society of leaders, and one way of looking at city managers is as stewards, and the staff as stewards, and it's described that way, and the council is the political leadership. But you're calling this a society of leaders. So in terms of your philosophy then that you've just talked about, how is leadership best expressed?
Well, I did write an article about that, and obviously you have seen it, the Society of Leaders, and I think that's the article I wrote at the time I retired from ICMA in 1983. That's 20 years ago now. And yes, I believe that. All those out there know they're trying to be leaders. And they are leaders. They obviously are leaders of the staff. I had 2,000 staff when I was in Tucson. Tucson now has 5,000, one of the biggest employers in the state. Phoenix, I don't know how many they have. They must have probably 10,000. This is big business. So to be at the executive head of an organization like that, you really have to be a leader. And to some extent, in the small city where you may only have a staff of 50 or 100, boy, you got to be a leader there. Everybody knows you. First name, maybe. Got to be a different kind of a leader, less executive, more coordinator, supervisor, than when you're with a big corporation like one of these. So they are all leaders. And they're leaders with the council in that they don't just wait for the council. I don't wait for you to tell me that this is the big problem in the city and I want you to do something about it. There are a lot of big problems in the city that you don't even know about. And I do, because of my staff and intimate day-to-day contact with what's going on. So it's up to me to recommend to you, get you interested in some of the problems that are going to really be good for the city and can work to your benefit too. So there's that kind of leadership too, even though the image of leadership and the ultimate leadership and what really counts is the leadership of the council. Got to know that as a manager, not just because they might fire you, but because that's what the democracy is. It's ridiculous how I get emotional about something like that, but I do. And I guess that's what makes it a profession. There are a lot of us like that.
It's important.
So you've had a chance to not only shape a variety of places and lead, but also to lead nationally a generation or several generations of managers. We haven't really gotten to talk much about how you've actually accomplished it, but maybe we can rely on other people to talk to us about how you did that. Maybe you're not the person we should even talk to about that. It's the effect of how you've done it. Maybe we can get some up from other people. But if you could talk to us a little bit about the ideals that brought you into it, that you still obviously feel very strongly now, there's kind of a constellation of events and circumstances that bring about the city manager form of government early on in the century. And it's been in place for 80 odd years or so. What do you see are the challenges now to that form of government? And what's the future of it? And this is a twofold question, which I don't usually like to do, but that's the general context. But do you still think it takes people who want to make a difference and really believe in local government and have that kind of attitude? Is it the same situation? You're really just looking for the same kind of a person to make that difference?
Well, I think you're still looking for the same kind of person. I think the future of the form of government is very good. I think that there are more and more variations on it now. You see, when it was originally started under the leadership of a man named Richard Childs of New York, he really did believe in the elected official and in the democratic process. Mm-hmm. Let me give you, have we got time?
I think so.
One quick example.
Okay.
One quick example. When I was director of ICMA, this man, called the father of the council manager form of government, Richard Childs, was riding a bicycle along the canal in the Washington area, and he ran into something, or he slipped or whatever, and he really got hurt in the fall. So I heard about it, that he was in the hospital. So I going right out to see him. He's a wonderful man, in addition to being the father of the profession. And so as I was rushing out the door, I said, what do we have that I can take to him, hand him something? And my secretary said, here. So it was in a box. It was a book. We produce all kinds of wonderful books about how to manage cities in every aspect of it. So I dashed out, and after he and I had talked a little at the hospital, I opened up the box and I said, here, I have a little something that you might enjoy reading while you're recuperating. And it was about municipal management. I forget the exact title. The Principles and Practices of Local Government Management, something like that, jazzed up a little. So I handed that to him, and he said, Mark, I'm not interested in management. I'm interested in the policy making and the democratic process. And you just got to have managers in order to make that work. Mm-hmm. So here he is, the guy that city managers think he loves city managers. Well, he does, but it's a democratic process that he had in mind. In order to make that work, you got to have the professionals who know how to do stuff out there in this more and more complicated all the time world. More and more expectations from cities. And so that's example number one. Mm-hmm. I don't know how well it answers your question now.
Well, I think it answers it well. I guess I'm trying to move you on a little bit to how the Declaration of Ideals and the Code of Ethics and the various proclamations of ICMA really are worth a lot, more than just the paper they're written on. I mean, what is it? City managers, you're saying, are there to implement democracy, representative democracy. And so if you could talk a little bit about why that form is preferable than another form. I mean, you obviously believe that that's the way to do it. And why is that?
Well, I think under that form, you attract people who are dedicated, whereas it's less likely under other forms. I think all of us who have a certain kind of competence want to work in a climate that supports our performance of that competence. And I don't think we want to work for an environment, a set of masters who don't really worry about our performance much. It's just whether this organization is satisfying them. Mm-hmm. We want to work for people who recognize that competence and appreciate it, reward it, just say a nice thing once in a while about it. And that's kind of the fundamental difference, I think. So the council manager form sets it up that way, that the council, they still run the city, they have all the ultimate authority, but instead of struggling around in a maze that they don't understand or know how to work, they've got really competent people out here who work for them, who are going to help them solve these problems. Mm-hmm. So it's really much better for the council. Mm-hmm. And that's ultimately all that matters. It's much better for the council in their policy making and governance responsibility, as well as being better for people like me that want to do this kind of work and have a dedication to it, starting back in the City Hall in Chicago.
Why is it considered such a threat to some people then?
The council manager form?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know who it's a threat to. Maybe you could name an example. But well, I think to some extent it's a threat because the city manager himself may get too big a head and may think he or she is really the top dog. I know managers, some managers like that. Their ego carries them away. They may be very, very good at what they do, but they don't pay proper tribute to the ultimate responsibility of the council. Mm-hmm. And to the support of the council. So that kind of a manager can be a threat. And there really haven't been many that I've ever known like that. Mm-hmm. But they're human too.
I was thinking in terms of a threat more what we've heard about there being a perceived connection with communism and the fear of an international movement that has something to do with installing levels of government. Okay,
well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I haven't heard of that for many, many years. Mm-hmm. That used to be the theme of an organization called the Birch Society. And I can remember that back in right after the war, 40s, 50s. The Birch Society was very strong. And they were anti-communist about all kinds of things. Regional government, city managers, so on and so on. And I haven't heard this argument brought up now for many years. And I'm sure it's still out there. These ideas are always around. But I don't think there's any significant part of the population that believes it. Mm-hmm. If they do, managers better get on the ball and start explaining that they aren't communists. You know, why do you have to say I'm not a communist? Like Nixon saying I'm not a crook.
Well, along this idea of ideals, you've talked about people like Lincoln Steffens and turn of the century between the 19th and 20th. And now we've come into the 21st century, and once again we hear a lot about civic engagement. And civic engagement is a big theme. And so in terms of your experience, is this a different discussion than it was before, or is it the same discussion and we've come back to it that once again citizen involvement is really critical, and so civic engagement has to be on the agenda of professionals but also citizens, and we need to be involved again? Are we coming back to that theme? Did we miss something for a while in the late part of the 20th century? Do you have some ideas about that?
Well, I live in Sedona, and Sedona's having a big struggle over a highway that comes up through their 179, whether to make it a means of carrying traffic or to make it a scenic route. And the citizen involvement is astonishing. And even more astonishing is the fact that ADOT, and I've worked with a lot of state highway departments, not worked for them, but with them, they are going overboard to have citizen participation. Now, in answer to your question, it's obvious to me that there is a lot more of that trend. Now, whether it's just a way of nursing the problem along until the bureaucracy is able to do what they wanted to do in the first place or not, I don't know. But when I started as a manager, there just wasn't much citizen participation. There wasn't. The mayor and the council, therefore, were much more free to make up their own minds and go their own way. And the increase in citizen participation seems to me to be going on unabated. Now, of course, it's 20 years since I've really been active in the field, but from being a citizen of Sedona and watching ADOT, watching our city council, watching our governor, watching our legislature, our Congress, I think the citizen participation, because primarily of the media and the interest, how citizens now understand how important it is what happens at a council meeting, what happens in the legislature. It's inevitable. It's the way this democracy ought to go.
Well, I think we probably need to wrap up. So I want to give you an opportunity. Is there just anything else you wanted to add that we haven't covered?
I think I've already told you more than I know. So that's a wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you for
Thank
the
you very
opportunity.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.